Picture this. A television network airs an episode of its most celebrated show exactly once, in the spring of 1964, and then locks it in a vault for more than half a century. No reruns. No syndication. No home video release for decades. Fans who caught that single broadcast swore it existed, but for most of the viewing public, it simply didn't. Ask a Twilight Zone superfan in 1985 to name every episode of the series, and there was a good chance they'd never even heard the title. That is not an urban legend. It is the true story of the encounter, and it's a story about what happens when a television show gets a little too close to the truth. Before we get into the buried episode itself, it helps to understand what made The Twilight Zone such an unusual show to begin with. When it premiered on CBS in October of 1959, American television was dominated by comfortable sitcoms, variety hours, and westerns. The Twilight Zone offered something else entirely, a rotating anthology of self-contained stories, each one wrapped in science fiction, fantasy, or horror, and each one narrated by the show's creator, a sharp-eyed writer named Rod Serling. Serling had already spent years fighting the television industry before The Twilight Zone ever hit the air. As a young writer for live drama anthologies in the 1950s, he'd had scripts gutted by network standards departments and nervous sponsors who didn't want to offend anyone, anywhere, ever. One of his scripts, inspired by the real-life killing of a black teenager in Mississippi, was rewritten so extensively by executives worried about Southern affiliates that almost nothing of the original point survived. Serling later described the experience as devastating, and it taught him a lesson he never forgot. If you wanted to say something honest about race, violence, or fear in America, you couldn't say it directly. You had to smuggle it in. The Twilight Zone became his smuggling operation. Set a story on a distant planet, and suddenly you could talk about conformity and mob violence. Give a story to aliens or robots, and you could talk about war and dehumanization without a sponsor blinking. Episode after episode used the language of science fiction to talk about the Cold War, nuclear paranoia, the Red Scare, and prejudice, and for the most part it worked. Serling found a loophole in American television and used it to write some of the most quietly radical stories of his era. But even a loophole has its limits. And in the show's fifth and final season, one episode found that limit and blew straight through it. The episode was called The Encounter. It was written by Martin M. Goldsmith and directed by Robert Butler, and it first aired on May 1, 1964. Structurally, it's about as stripped down as television gets. 2 actors, 1 location, 25 minutes, no special effects to speak of. It's what's sometimes called a bottle episode, a story confined almost entirely to a single room, built to squeeze maximum tension out of minimal space. The setting is a hot, cluttered attic. Fenton, played by Neville Brand, is a middle-aged World War II veteran going through old boxes. Among the junk, he finds a Japanese katana, a sword he's kept since the war. A young man named Arthur Takamori, played by a pre-Star Trek George Takei, arrives at the door looking for gardening work. Fenton, friendly at first, invites him up. He offers him a beer. The two start talking. What begins as small talk curdles fast. Fenton starts reminiscing about his time fighting in the Pacific, and the reminiscing turns into something uglier. Casual, ugly language about the people he fought against, delivered with the offhand confidence of a man who has never once been asked to examine it. Arthur, polite at first, starts to unravel too. He can't stop looking at the sword. His answers get sharper, stranger, more loaded. Eventually, he admits something that changes the entire temperature of the room. His father, he says, worked construction near Pearl Harbor and secretly signaled Japanese aircraft before the attack. From that point on, the episode stops being a conversation and becomes a slow-motion collision. Fenton grows paranoid, convinced Arthur has come to get revenge on behalf of a father he barely mentions with anything but shame. Arthur, meanwhile, seems almost possessed by the sword itself, as though the blade is pulling old violence back out of both of them. It ends in a physical struggle. Fenton is fatally wounded on his own sword, and Arthur, sword in hand, leaps from the attic window to his death, shouting a wartime battle cry as he goes. There's no twist ending in the classic Twilight Zone sense, no ironic reveal, no moral delivered in Serling's closing narration that wraps things up neatly. It just ends in wreckage. And that, more than anything else, is what made the network so nervous. To understand why the encounter got buried, you have to understand what it was actually doing, and why that landed so badly in 1964. The episode's central plot point, that Arthur's father was a spy who helped enable the attack on Pearl Harbor, sat directly on top of one of the most painful and least reckoned with chapters in recent American history. Barely 20 years earlier, the United States government had forcibly removed more than 120,000 people of Japanese descent, the majority of them American citizens, from their homes on the West Coast and confined them in internment camps for years. The official justification at the time leaned heavily on exactly the kind of fear the episode dramatizes: the unproven suspicion that Japanese Americans might be secretly loyal to Japan, might be spies, might be a threat simply by existing. There was never credible evidence to support that suspicion at any meaningful scale. It was fear dressed up as policy. So when the encounter aired in 1964 and had its Japanese-American character confirm, seemingly without irony, that his own father actually was a wartime traitor, it read to many viewers not as a nuanced character study, but as an endorsement of the very stereotype that had justified the internment camps in the first place. Complaints poured into CBS. Sponsors got nervous. And crucially, the episode had been written and produced entirely by a team of white creators, meaning the one storyline in the episode most likely to be read as an ugly generalization about an entire community had been shaped without a single Japanese-American voice in the writer's room to push back on it. There's a case to be made that the episode was actually trying to do something more complicated than simple stereotyping, to show two damaged men, each shaped by a war that had left neither of them whole, and to suggest that hatred and trauma get passed down rather than resolved. Fenton isn't presented as heroic. He's bitter, cruel, and unstable. Arthur isn't a clean victim either. His confession is ambiguous enough that viewers could read it as literal truth, inherited shame, or even a kind of psychological breakdown under pressure. But ambiguity is a luxury an audience can only appreciate once it feels safe. In 1964, with internment still a raw and largely unapologized for wound, that ambiguity read to many as an accusation instead of an exploration. CBS's response was quiet and permanent. Rather than defend the episode publicly or let the controversy play out, the network simply pulled the encounter from its syndication package. When the Twilight Zone went into reruns through the rest of the 60s and 70s, the encounter wasn't in the rotation. When cable networks built entire marathon blocks around the series in later decades, it was conspicuously absent. When home video collections started appearing, it was left off. For most people who grew up loving the Twilight Zone, the episode simply didn't exist. It became, in the words of longtime fans, something closer to a rumor than a rerun. Here is the detail that turns this from an interesting footnote into something genuinely haunting. George Takei, the actor playing Arthur Takamori, had lived through the very history the episode was dancing around. As a small child during World War II, Takei and his family were forced from their home and held in an internment camp, one of the 10 such camps the U.S. government built to confine Japanese American citizens during the war. He was too young at the time to fully process what was happening, but the memory stayed with him. Soldiers at the door, his parents' quiet fear, a childhood reshaped by a policy built entirely on suspicion of people who looked like him. In the decades that followed, Takei became one of the most visible public voices speaking about that history, working to make sure it wasn't forgotten or minimized. So when Takei stepped into the role of Arthur Takamori in 1964, just 2 years before he'd become known worldwide as Sulu on Star Trek, he was an actor whose own family had suffered the exact kind of suspicion the episode's plot seemed to validate. Whatever the writers intended, that irony gives the performance a weight it might not otherwise carry. Watching Takei deliver Arthur's confession, knowing what his own childhood had actually looked like, adds a layer of discomfort that has nothing to do with special effects or plot twists. It's the discomfort of watching history and fiction talk past each other in the same room. For decades, the encounter existed mostly as bootleg tape trades and half-remembered descriptions among serious Twilight Zone collectors. Then, slowly, the door started to open. The episode resurfaced on home video collections in the early 2000s as licensing and distribution rules shifted. It got a wider, more public airing when SYFY included it in one of its New Year's Day Twilight Zone marathons in 2016, more than 50 years after its original single broadcast. Today, it's available on streaming platforms and in home video box sets. Sitting alongside the rest of the series, it was once quietly separated from. What's striking is how differently the episode plays now. Modern audiences aren't discovering the encounter in a vacuum. They're watching it with the internment camps taught, however imperfectly, as an acknowledged historical wrong, with a formal government apology on the books since the 1988 Civil Liberties Act, and with decades of scholarship and storytelling that have made space for exactly the kind of moral complexity the episode was reaching for. Viewed today, the encounter reads less like an endorsement of a stereotype and more like an uncomfortable, occasionally clumsy, but sincere attempt to dramatize how trauma and prejudice get passed down through generations on both sides of a war. It doesn't fully succeed, but it's no longer treated as too dangerous to even attempt. The encounter gets the most attention, but it wasn't the only Twilight Zone episode that disappeared from view for reasons that had nothing to do with quality. A handful of other episodes were left out of the show's original syndication package entirely, for reasons ranging from copyright disputes to defamation threats. One episode, a quiet character study about a lonely man obsessed with a museum dollhouse, vanished for years over a rights dispute with a writer's estate. Another, about an experimental youth serum, got tangled in accusations that its plot too closely resembled someone else's unproduced script. A third disappeared after a real-life veteran claimed its story of a man tormented by hypersensitive hearing was based on his own life without permission. Even an Oscar-winning short film the network had licensed for a single broadcast slipped out of public memory simply because the rights only ever covered one airing. None of these episodes vanished because of some grand ideological ban. They vanished because television in the 1960s was a fragile business, and any legal or commercial risk, however small, was often enough to make a network quietly file something away rather than fight for it. But taken together, these disappearances tell a bigger story about who gets to decide which pieces of art survive into cultural memory, and how easily that decision can be made by people who never even watched the thing they were burying. It would be easy to treat the encounter as a strange historical curiosity, a relic of a more skittish television era that has nothing to say to us now. But the discomfort at the center of the episode hasn't aged out of relevance. Fear of the other dressed up as national security concern didn't end with internment camps in the 1940s. It has resurfaced again and again in different forms, including in the sharp rise in anti-Asian harassment and violence documented during the COVID-19 pandemic, when people with no connection whatsoever to a virus's origin were blamed, threatened, and in some cases attacked simply for how they looked. The pattern the episode dramatizes, suspicion built on ancestry rather than evidence, is not a closed chapter of history. It's a recurring one. That's what gives the encounter its staying power now that it's finally visible again. It isn't a comfortable watch, and it was never meant to be. Rod Serling built an entire series around the idea that fiction could get an audience to sit with something they'd rather look away from. And even in an episode he didn't personally write, that instinct shows through. The attic in the encounter becomes a kind of pressure chamber where two men, each shaped by the same war from opposite sides of it, cannot find a way to simply put the past down. Watching it today, in a moment when societies are still arguing over who gets believed, who gets blamed, and who gets to define what justice even looks like, the episode feels less like a museum piece and more like a mirror. 55 years is a long time to keep an episode of television locked away. Long enough for the country it was made in to formally apologize for the very policy the episode was tangled up with. Long enough for the actor at its center to become one of the most recognizable people on the planet and one of the most outspoken advocates for the history he lived through. Long enough for entire generations of fans to grow up never knowing the episode existed at all. The encounter isn't a perfect episode. It's messy, uncomfortable, and shaped by the blind spots of the people who made it. But its return says something worth sitting with. that burying a difficult story rarely makes the discomfort go away. It just delays the conversation. Rod Serling spent his career finding sideways paths around the censors of his day so audiences could face hard truths without networks panicking. The Encounter is proof that sometimes even he couldn't find a path clever enough. It took over half a century, and a country slowly becoming more willing to look at its own history honestly, before this one finally got to speak.